Hi, Sir. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Right now?
Okay, so we will start in a 1 minute. Is that okay for you?
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, all right.
A very good morning to one and all present here. Welcome to online lecture series brought to you by Intersections, Banaras Hindu University. Intersections B.H.U is an informal academic platform under the aegis of Faculty of Arts, Banaras Hindu University. The purpose of this online lecture series is to address young minds of scholars, academicians, and mostly PG students, and bring about an awareness of the recent and ongoing studies in the sphere of academics. Today we have among us Dr. Sharmistha Saha, who is currently working as an assistant professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Bombay. It is my absolute honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Saha, who is a very eminent scholar in the field of theatre and performance studies. Also working as a theatre director, Dr. Saha completed her doctoral and postdoctoral studies from International Research Training Group, Dahlem Research School, Freie Universität, Berlin, Germany. She also holds a M.phil degree in theatre and performance studies from School of Arts and Aesthetics, JNU. She has published numerous articles in various national and international journals and has authored the book Theatre and National Identity in Colonial India. Taking no more of our precious time, I, Agrima Mishra, on behalf of Intersections Banaras Hindu University, welcome you, ma'am. Before starting, here are some general housekeeping rules for the audience. Audience is requested to keep their mics off throughout and not to share screen. During the lecture, one can drop the questions in the chat box, which shall be addressed in the question answer sessions post lecture. All the questions shall be read out by me in the chronological order. Now the platform is all yours, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, Agrima. Thank you, Professor Singh. This was an extremely professional and formal introduction. I was not expecting such a formal introduction. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting here on this platform. So I've been asked today to kind of share my experiences with you vis-a-vis my training in performance studies and the field, open up the field view a little bit. So I would expect this to be more of an interactive session. So kind of taking questions from you in order to understand what kind of inquiries you might have. So that is the primary goal. I do not really have anything prepared, so I'll just talk about my own experience in doing performance studies and how I really came to it. Performance studies happened to me because I was studying in JNU. I was studying Spanish, actually, Spanish language in the School of Languages and Culture. And simultaneously, I would be very active in the theatre circuit in the campus. So I would regularly perform in campus and also in Delhi at large. But soon I realized that that led me to take a lot of interest in studying the arts, especially theatre. So I studied Spanish culture, art, etc. Even in my graduation. So I think there was one exchange program. But I'm talking about like when I was doing my bachelor's, right? So I did a course, as in this was an exchange program at Universidad de Granada, it's in Spain. So there was, as part of an exchange program, I went to Spain and I studied this course on culture and arts, and which had a segment on theatre as well. After I came back, I had already decided that for theatre and performance studies is something I would like to do. The campus at that point of time in JNU, they had just about begun with School of Arts and Aesthetics. So we had a few friends already who were studying in the school, especially people who would also be active in the cultural field of the university. So that's how I got to know about the school and thought about the possibility of moving into doing theatre and performance studies. So it entirely happened kind of from my own interest in the arts and my love for theatre. And because I was already uh, kind of initiated into the field from by my friends. So sometimes it's kind of good to have your, have very regular and open interactions with your friends where you can also discuss these matters. Many life-changing decisions are actually taken with friends. So I would say that, always be talk to your friends about these matters, even within your campus. They might actually be able to enlighten you about what are the current things that are happening, whether it's in academia, whether it's in politics, whether it's in the arts in general. So so that was my initiation. And then, of course, once I got into the School of Arts and Aesthetics, which I think was founded in the early 2000s, and I got initiated into the works of several scholars, several international scholars, and I finally, after my master's was complete, which was a master's in arts and aesthetics. So theatre School of Arts and Aesthetics doesn't really have a master's in performance studies as such. I don't think it has it now either. But for its M.phil program, it has something called M.phil in Theatre and Performance Studies, which is what I applied for once my master's was complete. It came from a very personal reason to do an M.phil, because I already got a JRF, and if I continued to do an M.phil, then I would get the fellowship. Because I wanted to, my primary goal at this point of time is still doing, theatre, performing. So this remains, but actually it was during M.phil when I took up my dissertation and I started working on the women of the Central Squad of the Performing of the Indian People's Theatre Association, which is when I really developed my interest in research, and I started learning up a little bit about how research is done within performance studies. It is around this time that I was doing a part-time job for a theatre festival called the Ibsen Theatre Festival. I think this was in 2009, when I met my future supervisor, Professor Erika Fischer-Lichte, and she had come as a keynote. And the incident is that I had gone to pick her up from the airport at like 3 in the morning, and on the way I spoke to her about my M.phil dissertation, and she said, "Okay, why don't you share it once you're done?" And I shared it, and she kind of liked it, and she then told me that there was an opening for PhD candidates in Berlin, where she came from. So Professor Erika Fischer-Lichte is a faculty at Freie University in Berlin. So this is how my kind of journey through theatre and performance happened, and finally I did my PhD, like it was mentioned, this department at IIT Bombay. Now, this is my own personal journey, but if I have to talk about the trajectory of performance studies as such, then we need to understand that performance studies, theatre and performance studies, as we know it today in India, has several different kinds of trajectories across the world. Okay, it is not just studying drama. So several times what happens is people come to me and they are like, oh, you must probably have, the most exotic text and the most important, playwrights. Yes, that is a part of theatre performance. That's not what theatre performance studies essentially does. So there is this performance. If you have to think about this, performance is a mode of cultural action. Okay, so in performance studies, what we essentially are looking at is the study of cultural action. It's the dramatic text that you study, the dramatic text that you study, but you study cultural actions. Now, by cultural actions, the moment you use a phrase like cultural action, you open up the field of theatre and performance studies a lot, in the sense that in the context you are studying not only theatre as in the art form, but performance as a form of cultural action in society. It could be weddings, it could be rituals, it could be performance insofar as how we conduct our lives, etc., etc. So there are, like I told you, there are several trajectories to how theatre and performance studies really happen. In Germany, it really happened with, because I studied in Germany, so in Germany, it really happened in the 1940s with somebody called Max Hermann. Max Hermann, who was the founder of this department where I studied, called Theaterwissenschaft. Now, interestingly, Theaterwissenschaft, so because I did my PhD from Germany, they will call me a Theaterwissenschaftlerin. Okay, so what does a Theaterwissenschaftlerin mean? It means, so Wissenschaft means science, right? Theaterwissenschaftlerin means a theater scientist. Okay, so in Germany, what you study is theater science, right? Now, and that's the department where you study performance and also theater. But they do not really distinguish in theater and performance studies like we do in India, or like it is done in Anglophone countries. In Germany, already with the work of Max Hermann, what happens is theatre is seen not only as the dramatic text, which is the case in India mostly. Also, it was the case in much of it whenever it came to studying the theatre. But in Germany, with the work of Max Hermann, one had already started looking at the performance itself. So not the written dramatic text, but the act, the event of the performance. Okay, so that's something that Max Hermann is looking at, and he goes on to talk about how the event of the performance chosen for performances, etc., etc. Now, in the West, in US, for example, because performance studies, as the name performance studies as we know of it, it kind of developed at NYU, okay, New York University, in the 60s, late 60s, 70s is when it starts developing under the professorship of Richard Schechner. You might have heard the name. Richard Schechner, when he is talking about performance studies, he also looks at performance as a very broad range of actions. Okay, not only does he talk about, so he's talking about theatre, he's talking about rituals, he's talking about all kinds of cultural practices. So, for example, the Republic Day parade could also be studied as something, which is part of performance studies. Now, this is one segment. And performance studies in the Tisch School of Arts in New York University kind of developed, keeping in mind that it is going to be an interdisciplinary program where you would see how performance is interlinked with other disciplines. Okay, so that was very, very important. This is not something that's happening in Germany. Germany takes a very different route. Like I said, it goes on to look at how theatre has this performative element, right? In the US, there is one more school that develops, which is the Northwestern University. And in Northwestern University, the trajectory is slightly different from NYU. What they do is that they look at theatre and performance studies from the angle of oral narratives. So they had a very good department on theatre and voice cultures and etc. So developed acting styles and voice cultures, things like that, and it kind of developed out of that. And also the focus on was more on the dramatic text and its performance, etc. Now in India, if you look at how theatre and performance studies develops, you see during the colonial period, of course, there's the Natya Shastra, which is, I don't know if we will consider it something part of theatre and performance studies, although we do study it in theatre and performance studies, because theatre and performance studies itself is a program, as it's a discipline that developed only in the 20th century. So, I mean, one could study Natya Shastra from the angle perspective of performance studies, and of course, it's a doctrine of theatre, an ancient doctrine of theatre. But to look at theatre and performance studies in India in its modern development, it happened with some of the colonial work by Orientalists, who were translating several of the Sanskrit plays or plays and theatrical works in India. And in many cases, they were translating it not because they wanted to know more about the arts and theatre in India, but they were translating it because many a times theatre would give them an idea about how the culture and society of colonial India functioned. Okay, so it was a certain kind of anthropological interest in these texts that many people started translating the Oriental. And several later works that you see about Indian theatre history primarily comes from there. You see Sylvian Levy, for example, with his Indian theatre. You see later on Indian writers. You have Himendranath Das Gupta writing, etc. So most cases, these writings would be about Indian theatre history, right? In post-independence period, we see performing arts developing as a training system, right? In the 1960s, so 1950s already in the Nehruvian national imagination, there were several institutions that come up, and the Sangeet Natak Academy, for example, was one of the institutions that came up to think about culture for this new nation. And National School of Drama is also at this point of time comes up by the 1960s. But these are performing arts schools, which means they train you to become actors and directors, right? And also other people who are practitioners. But theatre and performance studies trajectory remains the theoretical part in India. It mostly remained a historical study. Okay. However, if you look at performance studies in NYU or in the West in general, you would see that the development is further than that. There are philosophical engagements often with text. In India, however, philosophical engagements have happened, but that has happened mostly in the realm of Indian aesthetics. So it was not studied as something which is part of theatre studies as such, or that you're studying theatre, but all the study of elements regarding aesthetics was studied within the discipline of aesthetics. Okay? So this is a certain kind of trajectory that you can see that theatre and performance studies comes from. So it has different kind of origins. In the very recent times, you can see theatre and performance studies not remaining only a theoretical study, but also becoming a certain kind of mix between performance, like performing as such, and theoretical engagement. This had already started with NYU. There they were already, Richard Schechner, for example, was experimenting with performing as in the act of it. So he came up with something called the Rasa box exercise, etc., etc. So several things that he came up. Philip Zarrilli again, somebody who kind of worked with. Philip Zarrilli is based in the UK. Then he worked with performance and theory together. In India, however, this division remained for the longest time. I think now Ambedkar University is trying to bridge the gap. They have a MA program in performance studies. They don't really have a PhD yet, from what I know. In JNU, it remains a theoretical program. So in JNU, like I told you, the theatre studies program kind of came up with the M.phil. MA in theatre performance studies, I don't think exists. But then it again remains a very, very theoretical program. Although when I studied there, I remember we faculty members would encourage us to perform and also often submit assignments as performances. So something often known as performance as research, or PAR. Now, what is performance as research? Or you may say theatre performance-led research, or research-led performance. So I'll talk about performance as research first, and then performance-led research and research-led performance. Performance as research primarily developed in theatre studies, theatre and performance studies faculties in UK and the US, in the West primarily, not in Europe so much, but mostly in the Anglophone countries, where your critical engagement with performance was seen to be valid engagement in theory as well. So you were, when in your final degree, so when you're submitting your PhD, you're not submitting an entirely written document, but you are submitting actually bits of a critically done work, like a performance work, and then some of it is thesis. Now, in such researches, it is required that you have some sort of theoretical engagement with your performance work. That's absolutely necessary. I am not sure performance as research is something that exists in India yet. I do know that such faculties are, I mean, one is thinking about such departments, and probably IIT Bombay's ITC is trying to come up with something like that. I'm not very sure though. So that's something to look, watch out for. That apart, now performance-led research and research-led performance. Performance-led research, or this is also known as action research sometimes. In Canada, for example, it's called action research. So what does it mean? Action research would be the act of doing itself, taken as research, okay? And performance-led research would mean that it is the performance that you do which leads you to think about what the theoretical work, for example, you do a research on breathing exercises, etc. So that sort of work would lead you to think about research in a certain way. Then there is research-led performance, which means the performance that you are creating is borrowing from theoretical work. Now, these are certain aspects of theatre and performance studies as a discipline, but there is also the philosophical engagement with performance in the theory of, J.L. Austin, for example, in languages, the performative nature of language, etc. So he divides language between the performative and the constitutive, etc., etc. And he talks about, so he gives a very famous example, and it's been used several times, which is that of the wedding. When somebody takes the vow as I do, the moment that person says I do, it kind of changes the circumstances, etc. So, and that he calls a performative statement. So the saying of I do does something, changes something in the social status of the people involved. So that's a performative statement. So one is that trajectory. Of course, later on, Judith Butler worked on it. She went on to talk about gender performativity, how gender is something that we are, socially trained into doing. So the performance of gender in society, etc. So these are also traditions. There is also another aspect to performance studies which develops from hardcore philosophy, where you had Merleau-Ponty, for example, Merleau-Ponty, for example, talking about performance, and then you had, so it kind of developed from phenomenology to some extent. So I am not going into that trajectory, but philosophy also has given us the possibility of thinking about performance, which then is distinctly different from theatre as we often know, the study of theatre and such. So I think that's a kind of broad and brief overview that I have for you. today. Now, if you have questions, you may please ask.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now I invite Debashrita Dey for a conversation with Sharmistha ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am, for that enriching talk. It really gave us a proper understanding how performative studies gets configured in our contexts of teaching and as well as research in India. The question I would like to ask is that since we all know memory has an intrinsic role to play in the South Asian context, so and as it lives through the modes of meditative recall and embodied performances, so how do you think that, do you think that there is some larger ideal about the modes of being that is explicitly at work in these cultures, like the Indian cultures?
Not only Indian cultures, I mean, generally in all cultures. Uh, there is work which has gone on to show how, bodily memory, etc. I mean, bodily memory, saying that it seems that there's a store somewhere that you are stocking things. It's not how it's kind of meant. If you look at within performance studies, for example, even history and the archive have often been studied as repositories which are performative in nature. Okay, so memory or bodily memory, like you mentioned, is something that we carry forward, right? But it's not something. So in the study that has happened, often it is seen that these studies were led by gaps that were found within institutional archives. When within institutional archives you saw such gaps, you went back to what the cultural elements tell you about, about the society as such, about the culture as such. So whether it's India or it's elsewhere, this is true for all cultures, where we not only carry forward our own past or residues through our bodies, and not only bodies but different kind of cultural actions, but also some of the institutional forms of memory that exist. For example, the archive also have been seen in a certain kind of performative way. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. The second question I would like to ask is how does one re-articulate the work of hand, face, and even gestures in the current conjecture of the dominant global or digital media?
Okay. Now these are very specific questions. How does one study hand gesture, for example, within a certain kind of globalized world, is something. See, so in many such cases, the question of communities is central. Okay. So when you talk about communities, you do not really talk about them in terms of their national variant. So there could be a national community, but there can be communities of all kinds. Depending on community, it can be a community of location or it can be temporal community. So what is the difference between community of location and temporal community? Community of location would mean that all of us live in one location. So people, and that one location can be as small as you wish or as large as you wish. Okay, for example, if I consider myself to be part of community of location vis-a-vis Bombay, then I study how things have emerged here in Bombay, and then look at its trajectory even in a temporal fashion. So before me in Bombay, how did things emerge, right? So that is one way of looking at it, and the other way of looking at it is as temporal communities. So what does temporal community mean? So communities of the time of now. So digital communities are often temporal communities in the sense, for example, if you are studying memes, right? So memes can be studied as people not from community of location, but community who are in a temporal community. For example, you live in Banaras, and somebody lives in Bombay, and somebody lives in, let's say, Berlin, and all of us are able to still talk about a certain cultural phenomena, the phenomena of using memes, for example, as as something we do together. So in that sense, when we study gestures, it does not remain limited to communities of location anymore. Gestures, depending on what kind of gestures you are studying, could really travel or navigate all kinds of communities. Those can be communities of location, or those can be temporal communities, which does not mean that they have to be from the same cultural context as you are. They could be from other similar temporal cultural contexts. So people using Facebook and using memes. So you study all of this together. So gestures can be studied in those formats as well. But I think one of the problems that arise, I mean, your question, the way I see it, is one of the problems that arise is that often we look at gestures, whether hand gestures or other kinds of gestures, as always studied within locations. So you would take up a specific space and then study out of it, and not see how in a world such as ours, some of these are exchanges. Not only ours, in earlier forms also travel writing, or even where teachers and philosophers would travel from one place to the other, or several other traditions which have actually traveled between cultures. These can be seen not as cultures of specific locations, but traveling and creating a community of sorts. So yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. I would now request Agrima to continue with other questions.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for these enlightening answers. Now I invite Vivek sir to have a conversation with Sharmistha ma'am. Sir?
Sorry. Oh, my microphone was off. All right. I became so informal. I forgot even to on my microphone. All right. So as semester, I was discussing over the phone with you that the very purpose to invite you here is that we have set of students who prepare for performance studies in the interview, or let's say when they open up this discussion with me or along with their friends, they face certain problems which I want you to address not as a teacher, but as a researcher and as a student. So the first problem which they come across, and in fact, they face in most of the interviews when they go with a proposal based on performance studies, they uh, they like the experts say that this is not for us, the literature department. This is mainly meant for anthropology or let's say sociology. So, what is your suggestions to our student? Like, is a serious problem with the proposal? Obviously, they have some problem because they have not read. They have just gone through certain books, and because, as you said, that let's say, for example, in Banaras Hindu University, right? We don't have a specific center for performance studies, or in fact, more or less, we do not deeply engage with theater. When I say theater, I don't mean dance and the kind of cultural programs that department or university organizes, but engaging with theater, like seriously with the theoretical and philosophical viewpoints. So, what is your viewpoint? Like, what is your suggestions to our students? Yeah, that is the first thing we'd like you to respond to that.
See, the thing is, sometimes when you are applying for PhDs, now English studies as such in India, it is also something that is ever evolving. I mean, earlier, studying English in India would mean that you study, I mean, during the post-colonial era, what happened was, I mean, we are today in the post-colonial era, when post-colonial studies emerged as something very important factor within theoretical understanding of literature, etc., or social sciences, humanities, etc. Now, one of the things that was happening was to revisit what studying English would mean, right? So a lot of works in translations were then studied in English department. Right now, when I am in the English department at School of Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Bombay, but now essentially what I study is also studied under theatre and performance studies. And now theatre and performance studies is not a discipline department that exists in most of India. In many departments, it is, in many schools and many universities, it is still limited. In our department, of course, I'm able to help students with this because of my own background, which is not from English. Now, often at times you see that there is this resistance towards taking up research of this kind, and that's also because the dynamics of English studies, kind of dynamic that it has, several scholars do not really want to consider performance and the influences philosophically performance has had, the concept of performance has had on English studies as such. Generally on history, on philosophy, on every discipline. So they insist on studying literature, and in many cases that can be at the most dramatic literature. Now, I think I can see Shubhankar here. And I would, if Shubhankar can come up and talk about his research a little bit, then I think that would help the students here to see what kind of research can actually go in a English department. But before Shubhankar, Shubhankar, can you talk a little bit about your research, maybe what you do with us here?
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yeah, go on.
So should I start now, or you would answer to some other question? All right. So sir is quite right in saying that even when I was preparing for my proposal, I also faced that sort of problem that coming from an English background completely and working on a performative aspect, like I'm working on a festival of West Bengal that is called Gajan Festival right now, and there is a whole lot of oral narrative and practices that actually creates a myth as well as a memory, cultural memory with the people, and that is hereditary being carried out. So these sort of problems also comes because when we are studying in literature and mostly in the English department, we are looking for a text, as in analyzing a text. But I think what comes up with the research and later on also reading some of the anthropological material, the idea of text in the English studies itself have been evolved a lot. And now it is not only looking at text as a sort of written text as in a book or something like that, but performance itself become a sort of text to read or to analyze. And the research and mostly the sort of trajectory that has been built up, like a researcher going to a field work or something, doing work on a very performance studies aspect, the researchers become a sort of a part of that. So that aspect also brings and broadens up the idea of the text and its interaction with the researcher. So that actually, this sort of perspective and this sort of broadening up of the idea of the text actually helped me also to get into the research and have a sort of vantage point to start from an English background, so to speak, from a literary studies background to get into a very performance studies aspect and to look it from a different perspective possibly. And also, to some extent, I look at the ethnography, the idea which is very much important when it comes to performance studies as well as mostly anthropology. I'll just talk a bit about that ethnography also, when I was reading in the stuff on ethnography, it have also evolved from an anthropological research method to a much more broader that has been used across other disciplines also, like in sociology and to some extent English studies also using that, and the idea of ethnography as a sort of secreted knowledge at the very place have also been evolved with time. So I guess, what you have already said is quite right, that this English discipline, as it is evolving, it also getting much more space to incorporate all these old ideas and these topics to look at from different perspectives. And I believe that, that is what we all academicians look for, to enrich ideas from different perspectives. So yeah, that.
Exactly. That's what I was saying, that what has happened is that English as a discipline itself is going through transformation. And in some cases, when such proposals are not accepted or as is thought of as coming from other disciplines, it is sometimes, not always, sometimes also because those departments have not really accepted the fact or not really thought about the fact that studying a text need not be a written text. So that is, of course, one problem. The other problem is sometimes, and Shubhankar mentioned ethnography, and we often say that doing a couple of interviews does not mean that you're doing ethnography. I mean, ethnography as a mode of doing research has really a lot going on, and I think some of the proposals that we have, that we get, sometimes lacks that kind of focus, studying ethnography in that line. So I think, practically speaking, when you are applying with a research proposal of this nature, first of all, find out where you are applying and see the kind of faculty members they have and what kind of specializations they have. If there are people who are doing literature in the mode of novels and poetry and things like that and are not looking at, so the question isn't about whether one is doing novels. The question is if one is able to see novels in the perspective of the developments theoretically that have happened, whether in performance studies, whether in ethnography, whether in anthropology, sociology, whatever, and can one incorporate that in their own research. So look at the research work that has happened in that department, and look at the work of the faculty members, and then apply. Number one. Number two, I would say is that do not apply so since there is this sort of development within English as in looking at the text in a certain way, like Shubhankar also mentioned, I think it is important that you start understanding what is the element in your research which can be studied from the perspective of an English department. So, what is it about, let's say, studying fiction? Because in most cases, or studying autobiographies, or studying biographies, what is it about that which may, or studying memory, etc. Because that came up a few times, but that makes it unique in a department of English. So try to approach it from that perspective rather than just creating a research proposal for, let's say, I want to work on Gaju. Okay, so when Shubhankar came with the proposal, he came with a view understanding of the Gajum festival, where the festival was also seen as a performative text, and which is what interested me. I'm sure there will be faculty departments in India where faculty members would encourage such study, and you can have a look at that. And thirdly, the competition is very, very high. Sometimes it's not really about the proposal that you've written. I was telling Professor Singh yesterday when we spoke that we get like a huge number of applications, and from that we are able to choose only a few. And sometimes it's not really about your proposal. Keep working at it, keep applying in different departments across not only India but the world, and probably something will work out. Sometimes people also work as independent researchers, find out the possibilities of that. So, yeah, that's what I have to say.
Yes, thank you, Sharmistha and Subhankar. Obviously, Subhankar has been a student, and I'm sure that he's doing great
in IIT Bombay. So, one thing else, like I think there are questions popping up more, but before I go to the questions,
Sharmistha, you have a time on.
No, it's perfectly fine. What I was thinking in other dimension is this that when I was having a chat with one of my professors, then he was talking about that. Let's say, for example, when you want to work on local cultural traditions, right? So there are certain cultures, certain local cultures which generally people don't know, and it goes without saying that still we are stick to the canonized writings, and it will take a very like I still feel that it will take long time to question the very westernized European epistemology that has made us to think that the way they want make us to think. So in most of the time, what happens that local cultures, when you are talking about the local cultures, let's say when Richard Skinner, he could, like,
And
he
some
and
other
some other
friends could
friends could
develop a
develop a
new
new
study
altogether
performance
performance
studies, which
studies,
was
which
not
was not
known to the
known to the
world.
world.
It was
It was
their
their
effort
effort
through which
through which
that
that
people started
people
working,
started working,
and it
and
goes
it
without
goes
saying
without
that even
saying
in
that even
India,
India,
people could
people could
think
think
of in more
in more
systematic
systematic
manner
manner
about
about
non-Western
non-Western
theater,
theater,
where
where
people had
people had
attention
attention
on
on
indigenous
indigenous
theorization of
theorization of
non-Western
non-Western
theater.
theater.
So,
So,
how would you
how would you
suggest that
suggest that
if there
if
is
there is
some
some
local
local
tradition
tradition
which are,
which
let's
are,
say,
let's
on
say,
the
on
verge
the
of
verge of
dying,
dying,
right?
right?
On the
On
verge
the
of
verge of
dying, because
dying,
there is a
because there is
very
a very
set of
set
people,
of people,
hardly
hardly
uh, not
not
exactly
exactly
1,500 to
1,500 to
600 people
600 people
know.
know.
And if
And if
it,
it
it,
it
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 generates
generates
interest
interest
in the
in the
mind of
mind of
our
our
scholars,
scholars,
will it be
will it be
right to
right
go
to
ahead
go
with
ahead
this
with this
and
and
situate it
situate
in the
it in the
larger
larger
framework
framework
of
of
performance
performance
studies?
studies?
But see, I do not come from a position where I would distinguish between Western epistemology and Eastern epistemology, if there is anything in that. So I feel it a little worrisome if we start looking at knowledge systems like that, when you make a distinction between Eastern and Western, because we live in a world, and not from now, not because we are living in an increasingly globalized world. We live in a world for hundreds of years and even before, where where cultures have traveled, from one place to the other. There have been mix between different cultural traditions, etc. So, if I have to put it this way, then the thing is that cultures not only influence each other, and not only does it so. Not only the culture influences each other, but the knowledge systems influence each other. So one is that. The other is culture or knowledge as such are not never static. Okay, they are always evolving, even in their own. So something that one knew, let's say, and not only in the humanities and social sciences, but in something we often call pure sciences. Also, knowledge is something that is ever evolving. So to locate culture or tradition in a pure state, I think is hugely problematic. So one is that. Having said that, it is very, very important that you are able to study things that are happening around you. Okay? That could be, for example, in Shubhamkar's case, he's studying the Gajan festival. He knows of the, he's doing ethnographic studies. So he's going to the locality, interviewing people, staying with them, finding out, what goes into the festival and such. And I'm actually taking from what Shubhamkar has presented so far in the graduate seminars is that even in his study, what comes up is that Gajon has not remained the same throughout. It has shifted from what it used to be to what it is now, right? And not because of influences that came from the West as such. It emerged from its own being. Okay, so these are ever evolving matters. So, irrespective of whether you are studying performance studies that's coming from the West or not. Of course, one thing is to come up with your own ability to study something. So one example that Professor Singh gave was how in creation of theatre, in the making of theatre, for example, one has gone back to look at indigenous forms, which is also sometimes known as the theatre of the roots. Right? There has, of course, been a lot of critique of theatre of roots as well, in the sense that how theatre of roots is a certain kind of hegemony that urban Indian nationals have had on, let's say, less known or rural forms, and trying to kind of create static forms, whereas those forms in their own places were quite evolving. Okay? The other way of seeing it, so one was theatre of the roots, which kind of borrowed from this sort of quote unquote traditional forms, and or other rural and other kind of forms. But the other thing that has emerged is also culture tourism. for example. So culture tourism, let's say if you go to Kerala, you will see they would tell you to come and watch the real culture of Kerala, or even Rajasthan. You go to Rajasthan and they will tell you how the real culture of Rajasthan was. So but the fact is that each one of us live within culture, and each of one of us are never static. So each of these cultures are ever evolving in their own way. So studying the location is important in that sense. I think one of the ways of doing ethnography in this field, I mean, I'm going into far more details or far more, very niche sort of thinking about this. So one of the ways is participatory ethnography, the way it's done, where you actually very consciously being aware of your own being as a researcher, study. So you are not an outsider who studies an object, but this entire object-subject relationship is transformed. It already studied with some of the works of M.phil, for example. Now one might say, of course, they are Western. But the fact is that can we think about the subject and the object in any other way in our cultural context? I think much of it depends on the context from where we talk. Rather than looking at them as Western or Eastern, we should start looking at them from the context in which specific context from which we are talking. And much of it also depends on the research question that you have. If your research question takes you to, let's say, France and Germany, or to South Africa, or Bolivia, or whichever place, then it should let take you there. But if it takes you to a small town or a small square in your village, then let it take you there. So research, I mean, I'm a great fan of Tagore. Many of us are. Tagore said about thinking that short of fool, Bikoshito Hok, in the sense of, let 1,000 flowers bloom, and let 1,000 flowers bloom in also thinking and researching in terms of all kinds of research questions, whichever is possible in whichever domain, whether it's your own specific area or in some foreign place. We study Shakespeare, no? Shakespeare, can we say Shakespeare is somebody we can call him our own? But we do call Shakespeare our own today, don't we? So, yeah. I can see a few questions here in the chat box. If somebody
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, so.
We have
a few questions in the chat box. Ma'am, the first question is by Priyanka, ma'am.
Richard Schiffner in a lecture spoke about performance in terms of very basic performative actions. But when we look at performance studies, we tend to look at ritualistic performance, theatre, etc. So, ma'am, if you could please tell us how can you engage more with studies of day-to-day performance rather than these cultural or theatrical ones?
Okay. So some of the things that you can study, for example, studying gender, right? In Judith Butler's case, is one of the ways to think about performance, how performance influences work. The other thing so in my PhD research, for example, I studied how national communities are formed, right? Although I looked at performance traditions as such, so in Bombay and Calcutta, I looked at how performance cultures were developing and creating national identity, and how people were using these performance traditions to create the idea of a national community. So this is one way, of course. Then, if I have to give you more examples, then I think someone came with a proposal this time to us, which was primarily on, sorry, I'm getting these phone calls and I can't even see you right now. Wait a second. Let me just fix this. Ask me to join again. Yeah.
Sharmistha, you're already there.
Yeah, but my computer
Join from two ID. It's perfect.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, but I can't see anyone. That's the problem that has happened.
Oh, but we can see you properly. And even your voice, we can listen to.
Yeah, I can't see anyone.
Okay, pick it up. Yeah, take your time and pick it up.
Anyway, so what I was saying is, so you can look at, let's say, national communities, how national communities are created, or gender performance. So these are examples that already exist with us. How caste is performed. So you can look at everyday practices of how caste is performed. So that is something you can do. You can also, so this then does not remain within ritualistic practices, but you are moving more towards rituals of everyday life. So there's somebody called Christoph Wolff, whose work you might want to look at. He talks about, let's say, he has done a lot of work in this field. And there is one study, I think, published in his edited volume. I can't remember the name of the book though, but in that study it was about the culture of giving gifts. And of course, there has been a lot of work on the culture of giving gifts, but in everyday life, for example, this culture of giving gifts on a birthday or wishing on a birthday or during an anniversary, and how socially these are performative cultures, how these are created, what are the power relationships in all of this. These are also matters that you can study with. Because if you borrow from Zarili's definition, performance studies would be studying cultural actions of all kinds. Okay, not only theatre, not only rituals like Gajon, but also ritual everyday practices. The other thing could be, practices of everyday life. This book where you talk about the way one walks through the city and then what you know of it. So one can do such a study as well.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Ma'am, the next question is by Sharmistha. How can voice or tonality be studied in a spatial community in performance studies?
I finally found you in my laptop. I had lost you. Now I'm feeling a little bit more oriented. Okay, so voice or tonality in a spatial community. Okay, I think this sort of study will go more into linguistics, but like I told you, performance studies in New York University developed as a very interdisciplinary study, right? And now again, if this is also a very specific kind of study. If you're wanting to do a study of this nature, then you should see what kind of speciality the department has. This sort of study would usually go into linguistics, but this can be also studied in performance studies, especially in a situation where it's more interdisciplinary. So yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, the next question is by Dayakshan Zafar. Performance is considered as an aesthetic event and can be used as analytical tool. So, what are the challenges to it?
Performance. I'm not sure if one would say performance is always seen as an aesthetic event or not, because the element of the aesthetic is also something. So then you have to broaden the understanding of aesthetic as well, right? And then you study gender, for example, as aesthetic event. Can we study gender as an aesthetic event is something to think about, right? So I feel that when you say performance as an aesthetic event, then I think it needs to be reconsidered or rethought or kind of broadened in the perspective of how studies have gone into making of performance studies as such. So I was talking about the archive, for example. If you look at Diana Taylor's work or Rebecca Schneider's work, so Diana Taylor's work, for example, looks at how in the context of Latin America, it is often possible to know cultural traditions or how cultures are not only from their textual references but also from their ways of being, right? So now, if a way of being itself is an aesthetic event, it's something to think about. So that is one. The challenge is, I think, lie there. To not take performance as an aesthetic event, or if you take it as an aesthetic event, then you try to understand what an aesthetic event really is. If you are theoretically clear as to what it means for you, to take to you in terms of what is an aesthetic event, I think the challenge, at least for that research work, would be taken care of.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, Divya Mathur asks, ma'am, how can we study the performance in communities and cultures which thrive in the digital space, like fandom communities? For example, the performativity of fanish identity in the creation of fan fictions.
See, I spoke about how communities can be communities of location, or spatial communities, as you have mentioned here, or temporal communities, right? So, in the digital space, you would see communities do not necessarily develop as such from. I mean, they could, each member within that community could have a cultural context. You can go into the details of that. But then the community in a digital space can be studied by itself as a community that is emerged on that space. So community's definition does not really depend on any kind of cultural specificity, but in the act of doing. So there is this philosopher called Jean-Luc Nancy. He's a French philosopher, and he goes on to talk about communities and history. Okay? And how history is an act of doing that the community gives itself. And history, even within that community, is something that is ever emerging. So if you start looking at actions as acts of doing within a community, then I think much of the problem is solved. Then you are not stuck to a certain kind of cultural specificity. Then you can study each of them in their own context, and of course, then study each of the members who come from a certain kind of cultural background.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. The next question is by Aviputri Sthiti Pragyan. Every time we represent ourselves according to the structure we are part of, we change our identity and we perform actions accordingly. Then how will we know that what is our real identity, and will the structure ever allow us to know ourselves as we are?
Hasn't this been a problem with all kinds of epistemology forever, where we have always tried to know who we are, and we have never really arrived at the answer ever. So I to some extent think to find out the real I is a futile exercise. The real I is, you have seen in the theatre of the absurd, in existentialism, in all kinds of even works, in aesthetic works that you see. This has been a query, and of course in philosophical traditions as well. So I think it is a bit of a futile exercise to find out our real identity. Maybe you can talk about identity in its performative being, in its ever evolving nature, how it's ever evolving, etc. Recently, there is this essay by B.H.U who talks about this in the context of philosophy. So I did speak to Professor Singh, and I told him that I will share some of these readings that I'm mentioning, and I thought that these Sanil's work kind of talks of it in the perspective of philosophy very well. So how the matter of studying or epistemology need not be stuck to any kind of cultural specificity or any kind of temporal specificity. I'll share the article with you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It is the end of the session. Thank you so much for the very enlightening session. Now yes, sir.
There is a question.
Yes, sir. Sorry, sir. Ma'am, Ankita Basak asks, how can I find institutions that will be interested in letting me research a marginalized or otherized local but traditional group performance?
Google helps a lot. Google it up. I mean, like I told you, it's very, very important that you do some background research before applying. Look at the kind of faculty members they have. Look at the kind of PhD research that has already happened in that space. Why not on Google? What kind of institutions teach performance studies, and if within those institutions, and not only performance studies but also English departments, and where this kind of research has happened in the past, all the faculty members take interest in this kind of research. So, I mean, it shouldn't be difficult to find out in the world of the world.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now I invite Isaki to deliver the final word of thanks. Thank you, Agrima. A very good afternoon to everyone present here. I, on behalf of Intersection Banaras Hindu University, extend profound gratitude to all those who have assisted in achieving such a pronounced outcome of this lecture. Firstly, I must mention our deep sense of appreciation and sincere thanks to our chief speaker, Dr. Sharmistha Saha. Thank you, ma'am, for your reinvigorating and intriguing talk on the workshop of performance studies, where you talked about how performance is made of cultural action and how is it linked to other disciplines, along with many such insightful points. I also extend a vote of thanks to all the scholars who added more to this topic. I would like to take this opportunity to place on record our hearty thanks to Dr. Vivek Singh. Sir, it's solely because of your motivation, support, and guidance extended to all of us that we are able to hear such preeminent and prestigious intellectuals. I also extend my thanks to all the participants for their gracious presence and enormous cooperation. Thank you.
Sharmistha, thank you so much. I mean, I think now people have got some way to travel in performance studies. And if possible, please share with us the articles which you suggested them to read. And we will trouble you again because it is just we have just mapped the study. We have not still got into in details. So I'll trouble you one more time. All right.
Thank you, Vivek.
Thank you. Yeah.